Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for watching. I am delighted to have with us a very special guest today, someone I'm very excited to talk with. His name is also Brian, which is the beginning of how cool he is. But I'm here with BRIAN GODAWA, and he is a best-selling author and Hollywood screenwriter, and he is most recently the author of Moses Against the Gods of Egypt, and also The Spiritual World of Moses and Egypt. I've read the novel. I'm in the process of reading the Spiritual World book right now. But Brian, thank you so much for being here with us so we can talk all things Moses.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
A lot of people, of course, when they look at the Bible, they look at the Bible very skeptically. And so tell us, was Moses a real historical figure?
Oh, that's a can of worms, ain't it? In short, yes. But some very interesting stuff happened on my way to researching to write the novel, which is called Moses Against the Gods of Egypt. And I write the novels because I want to retell Bible stories in a way that is consistent with the Bible, but also I like to fill in a lot of the in-between spaces, the material that the Bible doesn't talk about, in order to connect the things we do know with that there's lots of gaps. Like, for instance, if you read Moses' story, right, you'll see there's one little paragraph on his birth, or a couple paragraphs on his birth. Then it jumps 40 years, and where he murders the Egyptian, and then he goes to Midian, and then it jumps another 40 years, where when he gets stands before the burning bush. So there's a lot that's left out, is my point. And so when I decided to tell the Moses story, all the other books in the series are the same way, but I want to do some historical research, but I'm going to be writing some fiction and filling in and such, and also applying the supernatural paradigm that I've discovered in the Bible. We'll be talking about that. But nevertheless, Moses was one of the more difficult ones because he's gotten a lot of attention. Of course, he's the foundation of Judaism, the Torah and all that, and Christianity and Islam, of course, also claim him as a forefather. But he's one of the most significant of all of them, next to Abraham, right? Mm-hmm. So, but I know that he has become controversial in recent decades, and a lot of it has to do with archaeological research, but also scholarship. And while I believe the Bible is basically historical, I also believe, though, that the way the Bible is written is not according to the way we write history. Right. So in order to understand ancient history, you have to seek to understand it, which is what the Bible is, within its context of its ancient world and how they wrote and understood history. And they use different paradigms for writing history. They use different standards and different ways of writing. A lot of them are similar, though, too. So don't get me wrong. It's not like it's completely alien. But my point is that I think that somewhere in between this radical skepticism that Moses didn't exist that's out there now, and some evangelicals Christians which is what I'm a part of, and who like take the Bible, read the Bible hyper literally, and they misinterpret and misunderstand a lot of things. Somewhere in there is the biblical truth about what really happened in history, and we have to dig to find out. So I did that, and but I also came across a lot of difficulties because I was a little bit aware of the controversies around Moses, and so, some of the issues are, the claims that Moses. Okay, let me go back.
Sure. Yeah.
Historically speaking, those who take the Bible, who respect the Bible, take it face value roughly, and when they read the text, they find out that. Let me get here. They find out that there's a passage in 1 Kings. It says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, he began to build the house of the Lord, Solomon, right? Mm-hmm. And so based on that text, if you say, well, 480 years after they came out of Egypt, Solomon built the house of the Lord, the question is like, when did the Exodus occur? When was Moses' life? And there's different various theories, right? Mm-hmm. But the Bible itself says, 480 years earlier than Solomon beginning to build the house of the Lord. And we do, roughly know when Solomon began to build the house, which was, let's see, what do I have here? I don't remember all the dates because there's so many of them, but
Yeah, there are.
what do we have here? Oh, where's my notes? Get my book, Spiritual World of Moses. I have it all in there. So anyway, oh, here it is. Here it is.
Total photographic memory. I'm disappointed.
Yeah, well, the reign of Solomon we know is roughly 967 BC. So if you subtract 480 years, you get back to roughly 1447 BC or thereabouts. And obviously it's not exact, but so 1447 BC had been the traditional understanding of when the Exodus occurred, and for many years. But then scholars had started to, reinterpret other texts in the Bible, and they began to they came up with the date of the Exodus being several hundred years later in 1250 BC under the reign of Ramses. And I'm not going to go into all these details about why and all that, but nevertheless, that has been the reigning paradigm now since the 50s or something like that. Remember the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston? I love him, but that was based on that recent research at the time, which concluded that Ramses was the Exodus Pharaoh, and therefore it happened around 1250 BC. So that has been the dominant paradigm, but there's some problems with that. Because even though Bible believers would believe that, and still some do today, when you look at we've also gotten in the last 50 years or 100 years, we've gotten a lot more information from archaeology and documentation that we didn't have before. And in roughly what that comes to is that there is a archaeological dig in Egypt, in the area of the Goshen, what we knew as the Goshen, and they've uncovered a city that they call Avaris, and it's basically Pi-Ramses in the Bible. And in the last decades, Manfred Bitak, an Austrian archaeologist, has been over that dig, and they've come to some conclusions about the various levels. And interestingly, they found several layers, and one layer in particular of a large population of Semites in that region. Now, Israelites, Jews, are Semites. Yeah. So you would think, oh, well, there it is. There's the population of Jews in the Goshen, exactly where the Bible said it was, Pi-Ramses. They called it Avaris back then. And so there's the evidence, but the problem is the layer it's on is in a much earlier layer than 1250 BC. And there are no Semites in that layers around 1250 BC. So that's where the claims start saying archaeologically, well, there's no evidence of Jews in there. So maybe didn't happen, right? And those Semites were someone else, right? But nevertheless, that's, and if you're going to take that 1250 BC for the Exodus, then you're going to have some major archaeological problems, because also the archaeology has concluded, and archaeology is not perfect and it's not absolute and it can be changed, but nevertheless, the consensus is on the most responsible scholarship for archaeology for Canaan, starting with Jericho, right? We know the walls of Jericho fell down by Joshua 40 years after the Exodus, so it'd be around 1400 BC, right? According to the traditional paradigm. But in the new paradigm, it's around 1200 BC. And the problem is archaeology shows us that at that time period, Jericho was not inhabited. The walls were already destroyed several hundred years earlier, as were Hazor and some of the other cities that Joshua says Joshua destroyed and took over. So the argument is, well, those cities were long destroyed before Joshua even got there. So that makes the biblical account false, right? So this has been the biggest controversy. And in my research, which I came upon a documentary series that I highly recommend, and it's called Patterns of Evidence. It's 4 documentaries. The first one is called Patterns of Evidence, The Exodus. And it's a fantastic, because it goes through all these controversies and it shows all the varying views, but it does make the argument that for the traditional date around 1447 BC. And what that does is that's several hundred years earlier, and all of a sudden, all this lack of, so this is why scholars have been saying there's no evidence of Moses, there's no evidence of the Israelite Jews in Egypt, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you move it back several hundred years back to the traditional date, all of a sudden all that stuff aligns up.
Yeah.
And you do have Semites, massive population in the Goshen at that time period. And roughly 1400 BC, you have walls of Jericho falling down and all these other cities being destroyed in Canaan. So it's sort of like, well, actually, there's lots, people will say, oh, there's no evidence. Well, there's lots of evidence. It's just that they're interpreting it in the wrong time period. But here's the problem, too, is that there are other issues as well. And we'll get to the Pharaoh of the Exodus, I guess, maybe as we discuss. I don't know if you want to do that yet. But right now, in terms of looking at Moses, then, in this documentary, they have an Egyptologist named David Rohl, R-O-H-L. He's not really a believer in the Bible. He's not a believer in Jesus, he's not a Christian, but he does respect the Bible and he believes it's basically historical. He would say some of it is myth, but he still supports the Bible. He believes that it's basically historical. So he will defend the Bible where some modern day Christian scholars will not. They'll say, yeah, it's wrong or whatever, And so he is a famous Egyptologist, and he has also headed up a school of thought about Egyptology that has shifted the whole timeline of Egyptology, the chronology of Egypt. The reason why that's relevant is because if you do any reading on Egypt, we're talking several thousand years, we're talking hundreds of pharaohs, right? And there is a lot of documents that we have, but there's a lot of confusion when it comes to Egypt chronology and actual time periods. There is a general consensus that people use, because you have to in academia, but there are so many problems and issues with it that anyone who's honest will admit that Egyptian chronology is a mess. Yeah. And David Rohl has brought an argument which is too complex for me to explain or even remember the details of. You got to read his books or watch the documentary, because he's in the documentary, and he basically shows that the basic what most people believe of the Egyptian chronology is not accurate. There's too many overlapping documents of overlapping reigns of pharaohs that are not accounted for. There are big gaps. There are archaeological problems, and there, as well as astronomical issues that relate to the historical elements in Egypt. Mm-hmm. And in all his books, I've read them, and it's fascinating. And the short of it is he comes to the conclusion that based on his new chronology, is what they call it, the new chronology of Egypt, a lot of things get shifted back and forth, and time periods are not accurate. And he gives a new chronology, and he's not the only one. There's a whole school of thought like this, but he's the dominant one. And he basically argues that, that he thinks that the Exodus did occur in 1447 BC or thereabouts, but the Pharaoh at that time was the Pharaoh at the end of the second intermediate period of Egypt, whereas most scholars now believe, no, he's in the new kingdom under Ramses, right? Mm-hmm. And well, if this is several hundred years earlier, and it's not the Pharaoh that the traditional consensus believes it is, because other theories by Christian scholars will argue that, depending on we're not exact on the time periods, but they'll argue that it's even Amenhotep or Tutmos. There's various pharaohs that are suggested was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But David Rohl argues, based on his new chronology, that it was a Pharaoh named Dudimos. Mm-hmm. And Dudimos, actually, he's a minor Pharaoh in terms of, compared to the others, in terms of the amount of information we have on him. But there is some archaeological, and there is some ancient historical documents related to Dudimos that we can find some things out about him. So this was what I came across in my research, and I thought, you know what? No one's ever really told the story. Look, there are different arguments, all even within Christendom, of, like I mentioned, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, who was the Pharaoh of Moses' birth, and this is one of them. And I just thought it was so fascinating, the information that David Rohl provided, that I thought, what if I retell the story of Moses within that context? What might that look like? And that's what I embarked on with the novel. And so consequently, if you believe it's a different Pharaoh, it's fine. You just substitute that name if you're going to read the novel, right? I think it's Amenhotep the third or whatever. I can't remember. But
Yeah.
so I'm following that as a novelist, and it's interesting because there are some fascinating, like I said, there's some fascinating ancient references to the actual Pharaoh, and one of them that I find fascinating is Artapanus. He was an ancient Jewish historian, and he wrote about the king of Egypt during the time of he's writing about Moses, right? Now he has access to ancient documents in Egypt that we don't know about because, Library of Alexandria was destroyed. We don't have access to that. But he's an ancient historian. So he writes about this, about how but he's also writing with Greek, and Greek names change, so whatever name he's using, you can't always connect it up to an Egyptian name. But for instance, he says the king of Egypt, his son Palmenothus, succeeded to sovereignty in the northern Egypt, right? That's the Greek eyes. But some of the names are very, very similar or exact. He says he begat a daughter, Maris, the king of Egypt, during the time of Moses, whom he betrothed to a certain Coniferous, king of the region above Memphis. So he's the king of the south. So there's two different kings at the time, two different pharaohs, which was very common. And he describes that that's the king that was, Coniferous was the king of Moses' birth. Well, there is a Coniferous named Kneferah in Egyptian. There's only one pharaoh, one king that has that name, and it's King Sobekotep IV. So, and that was right in that time period about when Moses was probably born. And so David Rohl argues that King Sobekotep IV was the king of Moses' birth. So I bring that into my novel as well. So that's the kind of material that I'm drawing from, the historical research and stuff, and there's a lot of other things too, but that's the historical element. So, and there's even, David Rohl points out that there is even a reference to King Sobekotep's son, one of his sons, called, who he calls Sobekotep Mio, which, and there's actually an actual rock stela that has this reference. And if Rohl is right, then Moses may have been an adopted son who was in line to be heir of Egypt. And Mio could be a reference to Moses, actually. So, and Mio might be a pet name that they would call him, So, because he's the son of Sobekotep, right? So anyway, there's all these fascinating little things. Anyway, there's another aspect of Moses, not just his historicity, but his character and who he is, And like I said, with all due respect to Charlton Heston, whom I loved as Moses, I found that as I did research on Moses, I found that he wasn't that much like, he wasn't like the way Charlton Heston depicted him. He didn't have that booming voice, In fact, Moses had a stuttering problem. And the text actually says that. It talks about how I am stammering of tongue, and the language that Exodus uses of Moses' description is the language that elsewhere is used in the Bible to describe stuttering, right? So imagine that, right? And so he doesn't have the booming voice. And plus he did have an anger problem, I found. And, not just in when he hit that rock, but there's several other references that as you read the text, you can kind of see he's got an anger problem, right? And it would make sense to me because one of the elements of Moses that I found fascinating was his relationship with fathers and his pursuit in a way of a fatherhood. And, if you think about it, his own father gives him up. I mean, he tried to save him, but his own father is not even mentioned in his story, except as a son of type of thing, right? So the mother's doing all the work and the sister and all that. So I'm not saying that his father was a nobody or a nothing or a jerk. We don't know, but he's not mentioned. And the point there is that, so whatever happens, he gives up his son to protect him, but he gives him up and he doesn't see him again for many, many decades. Then Moses is adopted by a Pharaoh, and then he discovers the Pharaoh is not his true father. But he's Jewish, and he's an antithesis. He's against who his father should be. then Moses goes to Midian, and he starts a whole new life for 40 years, where he meets Jethro, who becomes a father figure for him.
Yep.
But then ultimately God has to call him back,
Yeah.
and and then he brings his real father out of Egypt with him into the Exodus.
Yeah.
But he's, like I said, he's never mentioned. So you see a real struggle with
Yeah.
understanding
Right.
fatherhood with Moses, and I think the part of the underlying message of that story is that Moses has to discover that God is his true father,
Hmm. Yeah.
and he can be what his earthly fathers could not be,
I just want to
because
say I thought that aspect of your novel was beautifully done and very moving. You really explored that absence of a father figure for Moses and the struggle that he had with that. And so I
yeah,
think that resonates with a lot of people today. So
it's a very common, I think it's a common issue, right? I mean, our
yeah,
fathers affect us till the day we die, even if we don't have a relationship with them,
yeah,
And and how can you read that story and not see that underlying, even if it's not an explicit theme, it's an underlying reality that he had to struggle with. And
yeah.
so that was one of my goals, is to try to make, in a way, to see how Moses is very relatable to us, right? We see him as the Charlton Heston. And
Yeah.
I've discovered this with all my Bible novels. The novel on Elijah versus Jezebel, we think Elijah's this awesome prophet who, but it's like, if you look closely, you realize he's actually cowering and
Hmm.
fearful of Jezebel. So it's like we think these men are men of God and they're so big, but
Right.
really they're just like us.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
just look closely, yeah, God does great things with them, but God does great things with broken people. God does great
Right.
things with vessels of clay that are broken, right? And that's kind of one of the dominant themes throughout all my novels, and particularly Moses, because I do consider him a broken man, and but yet God blessed him and used him and gave him, used him in a mighty way.
Now you're not just competing, of course, with not that you're competing, but you present a different Moses in your novel than the Ten Commandments version, Cecil B. DeMille's version. But there's also the Prince of Egypt movie that came out, Steven Spielberg animated movie, and I went to see that, and that was, if I remember correctly, he actually tried to get a lot of support from the faith community, the Jewish community and Christian community behind that film, and so I remember it was all hyped up there. So but your book gives a very different Moses than what I think a lot of Christians even today are used to seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. And my goal is not just to do something different,
Right.
and certainly not to question the Bible, because like I said,
Right.
I believe the Bible, but I do believe that sometimes when we study the Bible, we discover things are not the way that we thought they were. And that's my goal, and that's my hope. And so far so good. People have been telling me, yeah, that's really helped
It's also true
open
that
that up.
that the Ten Commandments and the Prince of Egypt took creative license as well, because
Yeah.
to fill in those gaps. And so,
Yeah, you have to. You absolutely have to, because I did want to show a little bit of his life in Egypt. By the way, here's one cool thing. I also drew from some ancient manuscripts, that there are some legends or stories about Moses that are not in the Bible. And that doesn't make, that
right,
they might be legends or whatever, but they're written by believing Jewish historians. So,
right,
like I say, they may have gotten some additional text. I don't know,
right,
but I find them. One of the things I like to do is I like to draw from the ancient Second Temple literature and ancient Jewish sort of extra biblical material.
mhm,
Just to. I don't want to make things up myself. I like to draw from the ancient world and from their mindset. Well, anyway,
right,
there's a cool story that even Josephus references, as well as Artapanus, and it's about when Moses was a son of the Pharaoh, and he was a general of the army, and it describes how it shows him as a very clever military historian, not historian, military strategist,
right,
and it describes how he conquers the the Cushite kingdom south of them. And the Cushites were basically, they're Ethiopians, so they're black people.
mhm,
And Cush and Egypt had a long history of back and forth, and they traded a lot too, but they also had a lot of hostility at times. So it describes the story of Moses conquering Cush, and he surrounds the capital city, and the Cushite princess of the king sees Moses, falls in love with him, and they offer a surrender of the city if he marries her.
Yeah.
And so he marries this princess, and she's a black woman. She's a Cushite woman. Well, interestingly, this is one of these oddities in the Bible that there's one verse in the Bible. It's a strange one, and it's way back in Numbers, I think, where Miriam and Aaron are arguing with Moses, saying, hey, you're not the only one who speaks for God. And what about this Cushite woman? It's this negative thing. There's only one verse that says you married, and plus you married a Cushite woman. Like, well, what's wrong with that? Well, Cushite woman was black, and there's no other reference to her. And it's not a racial thing in that time period. It was because the color and race wasn't there wasn't a big deal to them. There's all different colors, and that wasn't the issue. The issue was the religion and the culture, and Cushite religion was pagan, right?
Right.
So, but it's interesting is that there's only one wife mentioned of Moses, and that's Zipporah, but she's a Midianite. Midianites are not Cushites, right? But Midianites are traders, and they live, far to the east of where Cush is, way over the Red Sea and everything. So it's very, very different. And you're like, well, who is this then? Is this a second wife? And when and where and all this? Well, I'm not sure, but I tried to work it in to make sense of all of that together. And there's even a theory that maybe even though Zipporah was a Midianite, she may have been a Cushite because they were traders, could be intermarriage, that kind of stuff. Right. So I try to incorporate all that historical legends and stuff and kind of have it make sense. And it sort of gives explanation to these strange Bible verses that we don't have answers for. And that's just one example where I did that.
Well, just chasing the apologetics angle here for a second. I mean, the fact that there is all this these extra biblical writings pointing to Moses is ample evidence that Moses was a real historical figure, and yes. So you were able to paint a pretty good 3-dimensional picture of Moses. Obviously you had to fill a lot of stuff in, as any historical novelist has to do, but I found your version of Moses to be very compelling and very believable as to what the Moses of real antiquity was probably like,
Well,
so
go ahead. Sorry. I was going to say, one of my goals too was, this is another one of those things that we don't think about because the Bible doesn't say much about it. And when it talks about Moses' early days and when he discovers he's a Jew, it's not really clear when he discovers that, right? Some people argue, he was probably raised up in it secretly while he was being raised. Because don't forget, he was raised in Pharaoh's house, right? Right. But there's also ample argument from the text that he doesn't learn it till later in life, like maybe till almost 40, and so that's the approach I took. Was like, imagine what would it be like if Moses was really truly an Egyptian, full-bred Egyptian taught person. Then he discovers, maybe at age 40 he discovers when he's a Jew. What would that be like? And he would have an Egyptian mindset and everything. And that's another element of the novel that I want to bring out is that I'm retelling the Israelite story within the context of their culture, which in this part of the story, it's Egypt. And this is a very different, unique world with its own mythology, its own religion, its own way of looking at things. And I've done that with all my other novels. A lot of them take place in Canaan or in Mesopotamia or Babylon type of areas, right? A lot of that part of the world. But this is the first time where I'm entering into the Egyptian world. And so I wanted to try to bring out a lot of that Egyptian culture and mindset that Moses himself would have. Mm-hmm. And God would work with that and change him and change his understanding. But nonetheless, God would also work with that. So I tried to bring in, make sense of the Egyptian religion and how it worked in their everyday world. And we can talk about the Egyptian gods. I'll let you guide.
That actually transitions to the next, because you don't just address the human aspects of Moses and the human struggle that he went through, which is obviously more than what most of us are going to go through in our lives. But you talk about the spiritual battles going on, and you treat the your whole, again, for those of you that may not know, Brian's authored. Have you read about 30 books? I guess
No, not 30. More like about 16 or 17, something like that.
Okay. Well, I started to count them on your website. It seemed like it was.
Oh, there are some booklets. There's a lot of little things like booklets that I write or little tracts, things like that. But full books, novels, and Bible research books, it's about 16 to 18, something like that.
Okay.
I lose track.
You've again, for the listeners, Brian's done a whole series on called the Chronicles of the Nephilim. And I guess there's a very, very quick side note here. Can you tell our listeners who are the Nephilim? And
Yeah, so the supernatural element of the story is something that is a component of all my novels.
yeah,
So, you know, all my novels integrate, even though there's several series, like there's Chronicles of the Nephilim, which is where it all began. The first novel was Noah Primeval. And then I told Enoch's story and Abraham. And then there's Chronicles of the Watchers, which is what Moses is a part of. And that's sort of like I'm going back and I'm filling in stories that I didn't address in Chronicles of the Nephilim, right? So you integrate them. And then there's Chronicles of the Apocalypse, which has to do with the first century and the book of Revelation stuff. And so, but all of the novels incorporate what I call the Watcher paradigm, and which is one component of a spiritual understanding of the Bible that is not typical of what some Christians understand, but it's biblical. And that's what the notion is. It's rooted in Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10, and many other passages, Psalm 82 as well. But that's the passage. Deuteronomy 32 is where it describes this concept that at the Tower of Babel, when God separated the nations, it says that he allotted them to the sons of, according to the number of the sons of God. And when you look at the sons of God throughout the Bible, you do a study on it, and I've done that. You'll see that it's a term about supernatural beings. Some people argue, oh no, they're human judges or they're human kings, but it's pretty clear to me, and I prove it in my book, When Giants Were Upon the Earth, that the sons of God were heavenly beings from God's throne who came to earth, mated with women in before the flood. But at the Tower of Babel, it says that these sons of God are the nations, the Gentiles, are allotted or under the authority of these sons of God. And then he says, but I will keep Jacob or Israel for myself. They will be my allotment. So in other words, God's saying, I, Yahweh, am the God over Israel, but the Gentile nations, which have a history of going against God, and at Babel particularly, it's like, okay, you're going to keep worshiping these false gods and building your towers to heaven after I destroyed the world with a flood. Okay, I'm going to give you over to those, to those entities, to those spiritual beings, and they're going to be your authorities over you, like I, the spiritual being, am the authority over Israel. That's kind of the concept there. And I mean, it sounds kind of wild to someone who hasn't really studied the text, but I'm convinced it's in there. And so that is a paradigm that this Moses novel uses, as well as all my other novels. And that is, I ask myself, what if the gods of the ancient world, right? We know they believed in, like in Egypt, they believed in Set or Seth and Osiris and Isis and all these gods. And people tend to think of them as they're just non-existent myths made up. But what if they're rooted in some true spiritual reality? What if the gods of the ancient world were based on actual demonic entities of some kind, right? And that's what the premise is that, and my creative idea is, well, and then maybe they were these fallen watchers, these fallen sons of God that God gave the Gentile nations over to, and he calls them watchers. They watch over the nations. And, we hear about this in Daniel, right? Chapter, what is it? Chapter 9? Oh, no.
10, whatever.
No, chapter 4, I think, is where he talks about the watchers. And then chapter 9 or 10, we read about the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece.
Right. Yeah.
They're battling with each other. Well, most scholars acknowledge that word prince of is a spiritual prince, that there are spiritual entities in authority over each nation. So the concept is, in the Bible, as well as other ancient literature, when there's all nations, all earthly authorities and powers have heavenly authorities and powers over them. And so when there's a war on earth, there's a war in heaven, so to speak. And so that's why in Daniel, he's talking about the king of Persia and Greece, because they were about to clash, and he's saying that there's a heavenly clash as well, right? So that's the concept that's going on. And so I bring that into my stories, and I say, well, and look, it's not like I believe all the gods are real beings. I would argue that if anything, maybe they're just these fallen watchers who have taken on the personas or the identities as
Right.
if they're gods in order to draw worship away from Yahweh. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
it's a masquerade, so to speak, right?
Right.
And it's a creative extrapolation, but nevertheless, that's one element that I bring into the Moses story. So when the reason why I wrote this novel was Exodus 12:12 says, God Yahweh says, "I will execute judgment upon the gods of Egypt." So if these were not real beings to some degree, in some or with some reality, some demonic reality to them, well then
Yep.
why would God be judging them? You know what I mean? Like it wouldn't make sense.
Yep.
But the plagues, if the various gods of Egypt, if you look at the Egyptian pantheon, it's like there's hundreds of gods and they're all interrelated. Basically, it's a pantheon that exists to maintain the functions of the nature around them, including the Nile, of which the Egyptians lived off of. So their view was that it's not like there's a god of frogs or there are gods that have frog goddess. There's a frog
Right.
goddess, but it's not like there's a God for every little thing. It's that the gods actually have overlapping responsibilities and that they were all working together in the Egyptian worldview to maintain the ecosystem that gave them life.
Hmm.
So when God brings the plagues, the chaos, he's turning creation into chaos to prove that your gods have no power over nature. I am the God of nature, right? That kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And so that's that supernatural thing that I try to, what would that look like? Of course it's fictional. Of course I'm going to be using imagination, but I try to make that theologically consistent, which is why my novels are theological novels more than even historical novels. That's what I would argue.
Yeah.
But then there's the other component, which is this, you mentioned it, the Nephilim and the giants. And another thing I wanted to do is I wanted to tell stories where there were giants in them. And that was where my novel series Chronicles of the Nephilim came from. The word Nephilim comes from Genesis 6, talks about before the flood, these sons of God mating with women. So it's like angels mating with women. I know that's weird, it's wild to people, but I'm convinced that that's what the text is saying.
Yeah, I
And if
agree
you're
with
going to
you.
believe the Bible, sometimes you believe things crazy like
Yeah.
a man rose from the dead, that kind of thing.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
like the seas were parted, that kind of thing. So it's not that crazy, really. So, but what's the point? What's the point, right? And so it says there in Genesis 6 that they gave birth to giants, which the word is Nephilim, and Nephilim means giants. There's a whole other argument about that, I know. Check out my book, When Giants Were Upon the Earth, and I address some of the arguments about what the word Nephilim means, but it ultimately does mean giants. And so that when Joshua comes into the promised land and that the spies come back and they say, hey, there's giants in the land and they're like trees and, we're like grasshoppers in their sight. Yeah, that's pretty much meaning giants, right? So,
Yeah.
and we're not talking 30-foot giants,
Right.
a giant is a tall man. So they could be 7 feet tall. They could be like basketball players, right? It's not like a lot of these Christians try to create this scenario where they're 30 feet tall and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do push the envelope in my novels to make it more interesting. So I may have a 15-foot tall giant every once in a while. But hey,
Right.
Goliath
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
9 feet, right? So, but what's the point? Is this just this weird anomaly? No, actually, when they're entering the land of Canaan, it's full of these giant clans called Anakim. And the text says in Numbers that they come from the Nephilim, and the only other place in the Bible where the word Nephilim used is Genesis 6.
Mhm.
So they're linking the giants in the land of Canaan to the evil giants before the flood, which is one of the reasons why God destroyed the earth.
That's right.
Man sinned, but the world was filled with violence, and this violence was connected, I believe, to these Nephilim. So there's a connection, and that's why they have to wipe them out, because they're connected to that flood judgment, and that's why Joshua has to go in and wipe out all these giant clans. So that's sort of the general. The idea is that the Nephilim are the result of heavenly beings disobeying God, falling from God, falling to earth, so to speak, and they violate the earthly heavenly divide. When God created the world and created the order, he separated earth and heaven. He separated angels and humans in that sense. And for them to engage in that hybridization with humans was a violation of God's holy separation. And so that, and if you think about it, holiness and separation is a dominant theme in the Bible. So
Yes, yes, it is.
that comes out in a lot of elements and components, and including separating Jews from Gentiles, right? But one day, so I'm telling all these stories where there might be giants. Now, there's not really technically any mention of giants in the Moses story, but there are the connection possibly to these watchers. And I did find that there was a time actually when in the story of Moses, when they've escaped Egypt, they've crossed the Red Sea, which that's a whole nother issue. Is it the Red Sea? Or is
Right.
it we won't go into that now. But anyway, so and they're approaching Mount Sinai, and they get attacked by Amalekites.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you do a research on Amalekites, they're not a giant tribe, but they are connected to giants. And so there's more than likely, if you look at Genesis 14, it talks about the Amalekites being connected to all these other giant tribes that were destroyed back in the days of Abraham. So I realized, okay, well, maybe I can bring in some giant component in there and connect it to Canaan, which will be the next story after Moses, which is Joshua Valiant. All right, that's the next story when they conquer the Promised Land. But the interesting thing is this is another one of those elements where David Roll, I mean, he didn't discover it, but he draws out the fact that there was an ancient scarab, which is an Egyptian sort of seal, in Jericho with the name of Sheshai on it. So it's in the Canaan, it's a Semitic type person and name, but it's Egyptian. What is that about, right? Mm-hmm. So he points out that Sheshai is mentioned in the Bible, in Joshua, several times, but get a load of this. His name is the name of one of three brothers, Sheshai, Talmai, and Ahiman, that are mentioned in Joshua multiple times. They are giants. They are giant warriors. And this is another element where, historically speaking, you have Canaanites raiding Egypt and taking it over temporarily, and that matches the Hyksos invasion. So history talks about the Hyksos, and the Hyksos means shepherd kings, which are like nomads. From the Egyptian perspective, they call them Hyksos, right? And there's been much debate about who are the Hyksos and when did it occur. And in David's Roll understanding, he points out that, think about it. By the way, in the time of Dudimos, he's the end of the second intermediate period, and that's the one of the only times in Egyptian history where the Egyptian culture collapses.
Yeah.
Why does it collapse? Well, think about it. If you've just been destroyed with plagues,
Yeah.
half your slave force left,
Yeah.
and the king and his armies are all gone, you could literally waltz into Egypt and take it over. And that's exactly what happened with the Hyksos. It's like, how did the Hyksos do that? Well, that's probably when the time of the Exodus occurred, and it fits perfectly, right?
Yeah.
And so I bring that in, and then that's where Sheshai enters Egypt. He takes over, and then he goes back to Canaan. So he's there during the days of Joshua. So these are the historical elements that are in my story. If you're reading my story, there's our fictional elements, but you can basically get the sense that this is roughly historically what happened, at least chronologically, in some of the major events, right? Maybe not some of the individuals, but the major events that occur. So I found that to be another fascinating component of the story. So there's the giants, there's the watchers, and I incorporate them into the story to say, here's what's going on in the historical realm with Moses and all the people. Here's what might look like in the spiritual realm at the same time, when these gods, these angelic beings who are masquerading as Egyptian gods, they're being judged by Yahweh. What might that look like? So that was my goal.
So you've mentioned some scholars that you have connections with and have influenced you. I actually bought Dr. Roll's book based on your recommendations. I've got his Exodus book now. Patterns of Evidence, excellent documentary series. Tim Honey's done great work there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know you're also a fan of Dr. Michael Heiser, and he's done a lot of work on the his book, The Unseen Realm. Um,
Yes.
and but do you find that the evangelical community, to the extent that you can consider us a monolithic community, do you find that there's a lot of discomfort with the notion that these false gods may have been real, real spiritual entities? Do you find
Yeah,
there's
yeah, absolutely. But there is I think there's a large acceptance actually and growing of Heiser because it makes sense biblically. But
yeah,
yeah, I think there's the anti-supernatural sort of reaction because what we're saying sounds a lot like the pagan myths, and
yeah,
there is similarities. But I got news for you. The ancient Jews have a lot in common with their neighbors. It doesn't mean that they evolved out of paganism. It doesn't mean that they drew lies from their
right,
neighbors and their lies in the Bible. What it means is they have a common understanding of the world. So they're going to use common cognitive concepts, common imaginative concepts, common concepts about God and about angels, etc. And yes, there will be some corrections by Yahweh directly or through the prophets, absolutely. But there's just it's just too similar for you to deny it. And I think that the weakness of evangelicals is when liberals came along, they wanted to show how similar the Bible is to other pagan cultures in order to discredit it, because to them that means, oh, see, they're just borrowing it, they're just taking it from there. But
right,
no, that's not what it means. It what it means is we are all people of our culture and we're affected by everything, but we use the concepts and the ideas around us and we spin them or whatever you want to say, or we what's the word, appropriate them for our particular purposes. So this is why you have and that's not to say that it's the notion it's the reformed notion. Calvin talked about this accommodation.
mm-hmm,
God lisps. He'll sometimes use our understanding in order to communicate his truths because we couldn't understand anything else. There's nothing wrong with that.
mm-hmm,
So the question just becomes, oh, does that mean the Bible's not true or something like that? No, I just think that it's using common concepts of spirituality that happen to be in surrounding nations. So, you have things like Leviathan, Leviathan, this monster. And I've done a study. I wrote a book out that just a little
yep,
booklet
just
called
saw it.
Leviathan and Behemoth.
Yeah,
And I try to point out that it's clearly a mythological sea dragon of chaos that most of its surrounding nations also had the same concept. In fact, Canaan had a seven-headed sea dragon called Leviathan. So it's the same thing. But that doesn't mean they believe in myths. What it means is if you read the text and if you study it, you see the Hebrew writers are using a mythical construct, Leviathan, to communicate a theological truth. The theological truth is God defeats the sea dragon of chaos when he establishes his created order. He crushes the heads of Leviathan, which Psalm 74 says, and he establishes his covenant order. It's a theological way of speaking in the world that they're very used to and very common with. So no, Leviathan isn't Apophis, the Egyptian sea dragon equivalent. It's a sea dragon that in other words, Baal, the Canaanite god, doesn't destroy Leviathan like the Canaanite texts say he does. No, Yahweh destroys Leviathan and establishes his creative order. That's the way they speak, and that's the way we speak too. I mean, we're often, even as Christians today, no, the Big Bang didn't come out of nothing. Our Yahweh actually is the origin. There has to be there has to be something before the Big Bang, and that's Yahweh. That's what it is, and that's how I approach it. And so, the fears that evangelicals have are because they're reacting against their fears of liberal encroachment. And I understand that, and I've had that concern myself. But in so doing, they deny or neglect or ignore facts that liberals are bringing up. In other words, liberals have wrong interpretation. That doesn't mean all their facts are wrong. And so you have to deal with and interact with some of these things instead of deny them. And I've seen far too many evangelical believing scholars just deny or ignore or neglect facts because they're inconvenient for their personal concepts of this is how God should communicate if he's going to communicate to us. Oh, really? Like if God's going to communicate to us, he's going to be scientifically precise. Oh, really? I don't think so.
That ordained me used to say that in order to understand what a biblical passage means, you have to first understand what it meant. And
Yes.
so it's very important to study the text based on how the ancients understood it when that text was written. And
Yeah.
so I completely agree with you on that. But I think, and you've talked about the the fact that in the ancient world, a lot of this, you've actually said, I've seen another couple of your interviews, and you've actually said that much of the Bible is written with allegory, stories, parables, poetry, really kind of touching the imagination of the reader. Whereas in our modernist society today, we're used to the intellectual, logical arguments and stuff. And there's some of that in the Bible, but that's not really how the ancient world
Yeah.
communicated with each other.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's not, and to say that it's, you have, again, this is one of those inconvenient facts that could be interpreted different ways, right? So the liberal will say, therefore the Bible's wrong, and we just have to, the Bible's wrong in some places, and we just have to change it, or we have to make up our own theology. That's what liberals say. But you don't have to be liberal. You don't have to conclude liberalism. You can look at that same factuality and say, well, then, therefore, how does God choose to communicate His truth to us through these various means? And like I said, he doesn't use the modern science to communicate to us, and he doesn't use modern historiography the way we write history. They use different forms. Some of it's similar, but there's a lot of it that's different, and that's not to be liberal. It's just to be true to the original writers and readers, because in a very real sense, what modern Christians, I just take it literally, what it says. It's like, well, yeah, you may do that, but the ancients didn't. So you're actually imposing your own modern view upon God's holy text, which I call cultural imperialism. In other words, you're not, when a modern Christian reads a biblical text, we have to be careful, because if we just read the way it's said plainly, we're going to misinterpret it. Why? Because what we consider plain language is different than what they consider plain language. And they're written in Hebrew, and it's been translated in English. So there's all kinds of problems you have to be very cautious of and careful before you jump to conclusions as, well, if this is what it says, then if it says literally, then that's what it is. It's like, well, no, there's actually a lot more to understanding than that.
and a very easy example of that is, Jesus refers to himself as the door. It doesn't mean that he was saying that he was a board with hinges, kind of thing. So there's a lot of that in Scripture. I do want to, those listeners who are watching this, who might be concerned that we're over mythology. I don't know what the right word is. We're not saying the
mythologizing or something.
Mythologizing, yeah. There you go. Yeah. But because, for example, you are very clear that there is a spiritual dimension to what Moses is struggling with, and a spiritual reality beyond the physical world that we are inhabiting. So you are very much, in all of your novels, affirm that, and I just want to be clear on that, which is one of the reasons I love them. Yeah. But particularly, there are some Christians that I find that have bought into the modernist notions and tend to look at the false gods of the Old Testament period as only and exclusively being fake, and that there's nothing at all real to them. And I think that that's a danger too, to go to that extreme. And when I remember when I was reading through the Exodus story years ago as a kid, I saw that the Pharaoh's magicians were able to perform enchantments and able to do different things, and so that shows you that there is a demonic element going on, there on the other side. So,
well, more than that, in Deuteronomy 32, later in that chapter, I think it's verse 18 or so, can't remember, but read the whole chapter because it's amazing.
Yeah.
The text says, Moses actually says that when Israelites went into Canaan and sacrificed to the Canaanite gods, it says they sacrificed to demons.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but it indicates biblically, and notice I didn't make this up, it indicates biblically that there is demonic reality to those gods. Now, exactly in what way, it doesn't say. And that's where I use my imagination, and we all make our, we all have to make our arguments. Here's how I think that is, but in general, I think that matches this notion that there are entities, spiritual entities over the nations in authority.
Yeah.
Right. And at least biblically, that concept is there. What that really looks like, it's not clear, and et cetera. So, but yeah, this is where I say, look, I'm not afraid to acknowledge that there's some mythical constructs in the Bible, but they're being used for theological purposes. And quite frankly, I think most of the time it's known anyway. Like I said, I use Leviathan, like people say, oh, Leviathan's a dinosaur. So, no, it's not. If you study it, it's very clear that it's a multi-headed dragon, probably 7 heads, sea dragon. And it's always a symbol of chaos, and it's always connected to some entity like Egypt or something like that. And God destroys it multiple times. So it's clearly a imaginative motif or a mythological construct. But the point is the writers and the readers know that he's not saying, oh, we believe this literally happened. No. You read Psalm 74. It's describing the crossing of the Red Sea. And in that describing, it uses poetic language. One of them is God parts the waters, whatever, makes them walk through. And it says God crushes the heads of Leviathan.
Yeah.
So, the point is that biblical text integrates historical stories and uses imaginative constructs to describe theologically or spiritually. But don't we do this? I mean, when we say, whatever, I mean, at 9/11, when those towers fell, the world was turned upside down, the world was turned inside out. We use these kinds of constructs as well. So I just think it's naive and irresponsible for Christians to be to actually maintain this hyperliteralism, is what I call it, where they think that the text is only and always just what they read it to be literally mean. And the truth is, nobody believes that. Nobody really does believe that, because you read these texts and they'll acknowledge a lot of places where it's like, oh yeah, that's figurative or that's poetic, So everybody believes there's poetry and there's figurative language and there's, imaginative constructs. It's just a question of where and what. And you can't make these blanket statements of just, well, whatever it literally says, that's what it means. It's like, no. That's what it means to you, but not to them.
I just got your book on the Leviathan and behemoths. I just started reading that, but you take the view that they are representative mythological creatures and stuff. But it is interesting that in your Chronicles of Nephilim series, Leviathan pops up every book, if I'm not mistaken. So.
Yeah, he's one of the most. I love him, but here's why. Let me explain why. And in some cases, in the older novels like Noah and Enoch, he's kind of literal, because my older novels are a little bit more mythological in the way I'm writing them. As the novels go on, it becomes a little bit more historical to match the genre writing that I'm doing. But Leviathan was one of my favorite, and he does mark my dawning realization of what we've been talking about here. But here's the concept. If he really does represent, if he's a symbolic reference to chaos, which seeks to destroy, one of the overarching themes of the Bible, one, not the only one, and also one of the dominant themes of the ancient world in their writings and mythology and religion, is the struggle between chaos and order. And whenever they describe their religions, including the Hebrew Bible, it's described in terms of God, our God, Yahweh in the Bible, is the storm God. He controls the storm, the weather, all this stuff. He is the storm God, and also he judges with power. He to them, the world outside of their community, of their covenanted community, was chaos, right? It was, like for the Jews, it was Israel and then the Gentile nations, and the Gentile nations were chaos because they hated God, right? And so the concept is God pushes back the chaos, or he destroys the chaos, whatever you want to say, to create his covenanted order. And his covenanted order is his city of people or his community of people. They represent that order that's created out of the chaos, so to speak. The chaos is pushed back, and the beauty of order is our system worshiping Yahweh, and outside of that is the desert, the sea, chaos, where the sea dragon lives, right? That's the concept. And it's a theological concept. It's, like I said, it's like within their world, it's not like they're ignorant religious people who believe in myths. It's like, no,
Right.
they're using creative language and poetry just
Right.
like we do.
Yeah. Well, there's a C.S. Lewis called it chronological snobbery. We have the tendency to look down on the people of the past as if they're just a bunch of stupid primitives. And
Yeah.
in many cases, they're smarter than we are.
Yeah.
But there's the echoes of the chaos and order thing. Even Jesus, and I haven't read Jesus Triumphant yet. I'm looking forward to that. But when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God is at hand, and when you look at I remember watching the Bible series, the Bible miniseries that came out and everything. And the whole first part of the series is very dark and very, violent and everything. And then Jesus comes and there's a light, but that mirrors what the Bible itself is like, And so you see the triumph in Christ, that he is bringing order. The Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So,
Amen.
so I just, you mentioned the Amalekites a little bit ago. I just wanted to chase a question on that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And in your novel, you depict them as, and I'm quoting from the novel here, an abominable tribe of nomads, cannibals who ate the flesh of their victims and seemed to be gripped by madness. You say that they were engaged, or Moses through the novel says they were engaged in the dark arts and were thought to be possessed by desert demons because they howled like it in battle. Now, how much of that is the creative license and everything, and how much of that is based on some of the research that you did?
Yeah, well, a lot of that is creative license on that particular one. However, the Amalekites are described as quite evil when you look in the text. They don't have details like that, but they are described as quite evil. And because of the incident at Rephidim, when Moses was attacked by the Amalekites, God says, I will have war on Amalek for all generations. It's like, wow. It's like God really hates them, right? And so because they're so evil, because they're so wicked, I just sort of thought through this. Okay, what would be, but it just doesn't describe much about them. It really doesn't, and I don't know if I don't think there are any other extra biblical sources that describe Amalekites, what they're like. So I have to come up with my own explanation. But the premise of it is, if God hates them that bad and they're really wicked, what would be the kind of things that they might do? Cannibalism, occultic.
That makes sense. Yeah,
so it's creative license, but it fit. Like I said, it's in order to address that concept that we do see, which is, oh, God really hates them with an extra hatred.
Yeah.
Why?
So, on kind of a lighter note here, just to kind of applause. I mean, you are a prolific author, and you've written screenplays. For those of you that don't know, Brian's probably most popular and famous screenplay was the Hollywood movie To End All Wars, starring Kiefer Sutherland. But you've done screenplays, you've done novels, and you've done nonfiction. So what's the most fun to write of all those? And then or can you answer that? Does it depend on what mood you're in?
Yeah. Well, you know what? They're different kinds of storytelling. And I've always loved movies. I love movies to this day. And TV series. Actually, I think in some ways TV series are superior now, or cable, whatever you want to call them, streaming series. They're superior to movies in many ways. But they're, in other ways, a movie's better too. So nevertheless, I love it because it's visual and it's dramatic and it's shorthand. It communicates a lot in a small amount of time and space. And it's human drama. There's something about human drama, seeing it take place, like plays too, or something, right?
Yeah.
There's something about that I'm really drawn to, and I think it's very powerful. And I do believe that movies and visual movies and cable series, movies and series are affecting the world. They're changing the world. Now, yes, books do too, but there's something about the visual drama that is most impactful to me. So I really love doing that. But to be honest, I started writing novels more as a secondhand thing, but it it became, I didn't know that it would become my living. And what happened when I wrote my first novel, Noah Primeval, I actually wrote it first as a screenplay. And I was going around Hollywood, and I'm not a big guy with big connections in Hollywood, but I was trying to get interest in it. And then I discovered, so we're talking like this is 2010 or something like that. Then I discovered that Darren Aronofsky was making, the filmmaker was making a Noah movie, and then I realized, oh, I'm not gonna have a chance at it. So I stopped, and I realized, well, how can I get my story out before his? Because I don't want to, what if he has similar stuff to mine? So that's when I decided, well, hey, I'll just adapt it into a novel. And then when I did that, I realized, oh, there's so much more to tell because this whole theological thread goes throughout the whole
Yeah.
Bible.
Yeah.
And my Noah novel was selling really well. This was when like Kindle was still, I mean, it was moving and growing, but it's not like it is today. It was still relatively young, and I just jumped in just in time to get the benefit of like, wow, a lot of success. And I realized, well, I can make more money, because the problem is that movies are almost impossible to make. Sometimes you might write one movie every 2-3 years because it's just,
Yeah.
or you write them and you don't get them made. But in terms of an income, it wasn't a very good income, a good solid income. And I realized that my novels were selling, and that has become my normal income. And I now do movies. I don't have to choose movies because I need to. I can choose the ones I really believe in and what I want to work on. And I am. And in fact, my latest, I've got a movie coming out in a couple months, and it's a little bit more. It's a little bit more. It's a political satire,
Yeah.
and I love doing. It's called My Son Hunter. You can go see it at mysonhunter.com. It's about Hunter Biden's laptop. It's not a documentary. It's actually a political satire, kind of like Wolf of Wall Street or
Okay, cool. Yeah.
the Big Short meets House of Cards, right? So it's kind of dark. It's a little racy because, of course, he is a very despicable addict and sexual addict, drug addict, and all this. But the goal was not to do like just a raw political attack. There's a whole human family dynamic going on within the Biden family that we found fascinating. We wanted to explore that human side and not make him out to be a demon, but I actually had sympathy for him writing the story. I really did. And so that's an example of a movie coming. It's independently produced right now. So go to mysonhunter.com and get the information on it. And you'll if you sign up there, they'll let you know when it comes out. Cause I don't know where it's coming out, cause Hollywood will not distribute this movie. So it's going to have to be online somewhere. But,
Yeah.
and if you're of a different political persuasion, trust me, I think it's fair enough. I mean, it's definitely a political satire, so it may take some jabs, but it's very fair and honest. And it's something no one else is going to do because the dominant media is controlled by one viewpoint. And don't you want to see other viewpoints, even out of curiosity? And it's very entertaining and it's humorous. So I'm proud of that. And to wrap up the answer to what you're saying is still love doing movies, but my novels was a surprise to me that God provided. Sometimes you have to take the opportunities that God gives you, even if you're not aware at first that it's the best thing. You do it, and I had the opportunity to write the novel, and it was doing well, so I pursued it, and I'm making a good income now. But what I discovered was my novel writing actually incorporates more of who I am than my movies because I'm free to draw from theology that I have studied for decades, I'm interested in weird esoteric things, like Michael Heiser stuff, right? Like watchers and stuff. And I would study this stuff, and most Christians aren't even interested in listening to it. So it's like, okay, whatever. But now I get a chance to incorporate all my Bible study and communicate that in a helpful way to the Christian community in a way that I never have ever been able to before in my life. And I'm using more of who I am. Like, when you do a movie, you can't be very explicit theologically because, you got a wider audience, blah, blah, blah. But when I'm writing my own novels, I can be exactly who I am and I don't have to hide anything. And it's not like I'm hiding something in my movies, but I'm just saying I'm drawing from material that I wouldn't be able to incorporate as much into my movies. And so I'm really grateful for that.
Are you good friends with Dr. Heiser? Because I can imagine I can imagine that he would be excited to see the novel series because you're you're in a very effective way, compelling way, through stories,
Yeah.
showing what Dr. Heiser's understanding of the Bible is, if I can say it that way.
Yeah, in fact, I was one of the first members on his board of his ministry, Miklot, and
Okay.
because we connected up many years ago, when I discovered him. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I actually discovered him doing my research for my original Noah Primeval script. That's why
Okay.
this all came out, because I was like, when I'm researching him. When I discovered him, I'm like, this is wild, but he believes the Bible. He's not a liberal, and
Right.
and this was fascinating information, and that became so Heiser's work became a foundation for all my novels. And it helped me see the Bible in a new way. And it opened up these theological themes that were fascinating. The war of the seed, the seed of the serpent, and the Nephilim, and all this stuff. And it made sense of strange Bible passages that
Yeah.
never did before. So yeah, he was a key element. So he wrote the foreword to my book, When Giants Were Upon the Earth. And that's a book that is my biblical research behind all of the novels of
Yeah.
Chronicles of the Nephilim.
I bought that.
So
I haven't read it yet, but
yeah.
I bought that. So I'm actually reading three of your books at the same time right now. I think I have undiagnosed ADD. It's not good, but with I'm reading Psalm 82, with the
Oh,
book that
cool.
you did on that, which is really good, and also the spiritual world of Moses in Egypt. I'm reading that, and then the Behemoth and the Leviathan book that just came out. So
Cool.
I have read Dr. Heiser's book Supernatural, which I guess was like a summarized version of the Unseen Realm.
Yeah.
But I plan to read the Unseen Realm this year.
Please do.
Yeah.
It's superior if you really want to know, if you want to do in-depth Bible study. And supernatural is just for people who don't want to get that deep, but they want to get the concepts.
Yeah.
But Unseen Realm goes deep into the Bible, and I'm like that, so I need that stuff. I need the deep Bible research, because I want it to be proven to me. Quote the Bible verse.
Yeah.
So
Do you find that I was not a fan of Darren Aronofsky's Noah Russell Crowe? No.
it
uh,
was garbage.
yeah.
And it made God out to be evil. And
Right. Yeah.
I actually wrote a big article on it. I got a hold of the script before the movie came out, so I wrote a viral article because I critiqued the script
Mhm.
in public. It's basically, it's he says this too. He worships the earth. Darren Aronofsky is an earth worshiper, so he was just taking the Bible story, and he was appropriating it to tell his environmental parable, and that's all it was. He doesn't worship God; he worships the earth.
And the Christian Bale movie on Moses
That was
also.
horrendous too.
Yeah.
Movie made by atheists, and Aronofsky's an atheist too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exodus movie was directed by an atheist, written by an atheist, and so it's no surprise that they're going to make God out to be a child with a temper tantrum, because that's how
Yeah.
they see the Bible.
Yeah.
It's just pathetic. And I
But
don't know how
I
well it
gotta
did
say
in
it's
box office.
frustrating because it just, and this is what I'm having a hard time understanding this, because there are a lot of talented Christians out there, and there are a lot of wealthy Christians out there. But it seems like when it comes to the movies that we get on our television set or on cable or Hollywood, that's dominated by people that are hostile to the Christian worldview and to the Bible. And I would like to see a movie based on your books. Why can't that happen? I guess.
Yeah, it'll never happen because it's too expensive. My movies would be, because there's a lot of special effects. It would be like $200 million movie, or at least $150 million movie. And Hollywood does not. My themes are very Christ centered and God centered and stuff. So Hollywood's not going to like that. They'll never make them. So I wouldn't even think about it or dream about it. But yeah, that's the problem, is the people in power.
Yeah.
They're all leftist or liberals or God haters, and so now there is some good movies that get through. There are good movies that get through, and people can work within the system. And I belong to a community of people like that in Hollywood, and there's a lot of Christians in Hollywood, but in the most recent couple years, they're cracking down now, where as our cultures become more fascistic with those in control, those who are in power. So Hollywood has become fascistic, and it does not tolerate now. It's hunting out Christians and conservatives, and it's not going to allow the stuff that we used to be able to get through. This is why there's a parallel economy starting, and that's a sad reality. But and what that means is we're not going to have very good movies for a while until we make more money at them. But you've got VidAngel in some of these places, like
Yeah.
with their bad Christian movies, But
Yeah.
what's the other one?
Those Pure Flicks, but they changed.
Pure Flicks, but that was bought out and stuff.
Yeah.
But there are other places that are making good movies, like the Daily Wire. They're putting out movies that are not conservative. They're just got conservative values. They're not like propaganda like Hollywood, right? But nowadays, just having conservative values in a movie, you can't get it made. And that's good enough, So we have to accept that there's going to be a parallel economy, and we have to support it. So you need to all go out and go on the Daily Wire and pay to see their movie, pay for 1 month, $14 or whatever, and you get to see the latest couple movies they have. They have 3 movies now. You can see 3 movies, and it's worth it. Just pay for 1 month, and that's good enough. I've done it. But we need to support these parallel economies of Christian and conservative movies, if that's what you are, because that's the only way we can make more of them.
Yeah, there was one that Epoch TV or Epoch something like that, and
Epoch TV.
They just came out with a movie, Washington's Armor, that I really want to see. I'm a huge George Washington fan. I love the Founding Fathers. So I'm
Is it a documentary or?
It's actually a narrative movie, I think.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. I want to see that myself then.
And it's inspired by David Barton's book, The Bulletproof George Washington. And so so I definitely want to see that. Cool. So I agree with you. We need to support, as Christians, we need to support what our brothers and sisters in Christ are doing to kind of, offer these things. But is there any hope that you might write a book that might be scaled down in terms of special effects, and we could see that on the big screen?
Well, not the Bible books, that's for sure. But I do actually have a novel. I can't talk about it now, but it's a serial killer novel, a thriller, kind of like Silence of the Lambs, and it's kind of infamous because I've had the script written for a long time. I haven't been able to make it as a movie, but however, I might be novelizing it. So that might be my next thing, and that will be more affordable.
Okay, cool.
So we'll see. It's kind of like American Psycho, but in the American university.
How long does it take you to write a screenplay versus write a novel?
Yeah, it all depends. I have to do a lot of research for both, a lot of work on both. I could probably do a screenplay quicker, depending on it, right? But several months. I've done it in like a month and a half. I've done it less because a lot of times you just get demands. We got to get this quickly. We got to get it done. So I've done it everywhere from like a month and a half to 3 months, for most of the scripts I've done. And books, more like 6 months or so, something like that. But last year, my last novel, Moses, took me a year, but partially because I did have a lot extra research I had to do, but then partially because I moved from LA to Texas and I lost months in writing. So I kind of, to be fair, it was more, it was less than a year, but it was a year from my last novel. So I escaped LA.
Well, do you miss LA? Are you happy in Texas now and stuff?
Very happy in Texas, absolutely. I mean, there are things I might miss from LA, like the weather, obviously.
Yeah.
Or the lack of weather, 72 degrees year round type of thing, But like, do I miss California? No.
Yeah.
No, I never really felt at home there. I feel at home in Texas. People are better, kinder here, nicer people, values, all that kind of stuff,
Well, for all things Godawa, I encourage all of you to go visit Brian's website, which is pretty simple, pretty easy to get to. It's just www.godawa.com. And you can get links to all of Brian's books, nonfiction and fiction. I strongly recommend the Chronicles of the Nephilim series. And I've read, I'm working my way through it, about halfway through that right now. I took a break to read the Moses novel, which is part of the Chronicles of the Watchers series. But I bought your book on Elijah. I'm dying to read that, but I'm trying to do it in sequence. So I gotta go back and read Joshua and Caleb now and work my way there. But it's just neat that the Lord has used you to kind of bring the Bible to life, I think, for a lot of people.
Thanks,
so
Brian.
I'm excited about that. And thank you for all your hard work. And thank you for taking time to do this interview with me. I really appreciate it.
You bet.
So God bless and take care.
Thanks.